The most famous paintings of Diego Velázquez. In this video, we will see Velázquez's most famous paintings. The most famous Spanish artist of Baroque art in the entire history of art. Las Meninas. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1656. It is much more than just a painting. It is one of the most studied works of art in history, and yet not all historians agree on its meaning, genre, and even date. Mirrors, paintings within paintings, people looking the viewer in the eye. The secrets hidden in this canvas of life-size figures are almost as fascinating as its amazing technique. The work was entitled The Family of Felipe IV, but the king at first does not seem the protagonist. There we have the Infanta Margarita, the center of attention in the painting, flanked by two meninas who attend to her, Maria Agustina Sarmiento, who offers her water, and Isabel de Velasco. A dwarf, Maribarbala, and Nicolasito Perdisado, the jester, who kicks the mastiff. Let us remember that Velázquez painted several buffoons during his career. Velázquez is brave enough to represent himself plying his craft with palette in hand, so we already have some clue as to what he meant by painting this canvas. It probably has something to do with the painting. And finally, there are the kings Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, but reflected in a mirror. The real protagonists are outside the box. Picasso was obsessed with the painting for years and even said that he would lock himself in a room and not come out until he understood the meaning of Las Meninas, and Dalí said that famous phrase when asked what he would save from the Prado if there was a fire. Dalí, it would take away nothing less than the air, and specifically the air contained in Las Meninas de Velázquez, which is the best quality air that exists. Portrait of Innocent X, artwork by Diego Rivera, from the year 1650. For many, the best portrait in history. Innocent X looks real, disturbing, intelligent. His gaze follows you. Velázquez, genius of Spanish Baroque painting of the Golden Age, shows in this work done in his maturity and impeccable technique. With loose brushstrokes, he portrays the pontiff with great realism, placing him in a natural, half-length posture, seated and turned towards the observer. The artist makes use of new artistic procedures and knowledge of pigments to decisively use different shades of red on the chair, the background curtain and part of the portrait's clothing, as well as glazes and textures that achieve a luminous in a masterful way. Although the tenebrism is abandoned, the contrasts between lights and shadows continue to be marked. But in addition to Velázquez's mastery of color, the most characteristic feature of this portrait is the psychological impact it produces upon seeing it. The figure does not express movement, but at the same time it is not static, it is life. It offers a connection with the viewer who is attracted by the Pope's eyes that show the soul. An intimate moment, an emotional impact that does not leave you indifferent. The artist achieves, without extreme detail, that the viewer finishes the painting in his head, an idea that was later developed by the Impressionists for whom Velázquez was a reference. The Forge of Vulcan. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1630. Showing very little discretion, Apollo, god of the sun, tells Vulcan, god of fire, that his wife Venus is cuckolding him with Mars. At that precise moment, Vulcan's assistants, the Cyclopes, are working in his forge, which is the forge where metal is worked, and upon hearing the news that Apollo brings, they look at the god in surprise. But perhaps they are not surprised by the infidelity, since all of Olympus already knew of the adulterous love affair between Mars and Venus, but perhaps surprised that Apollo is such a sneak and informer. Diego Velázquez was at the height of his genius. When he painted this, he was in Rome and, of course, this classical environment must have influenced the artist, who decided to create out of nowhere and by his own decision a painting about the adultery narrated by Ovid. The subject had already been treated by other artists. However, never in such an original way, at the very moment of the news, but rather when Vulcano decides to hunt down the lovers red-handed. And as always, the whys and wherefores of this artist are a mystery. Perhaps he wanted to represent inspiration by visiting the minor arts. Who knows? What we do know is that the live picture is impressive. It is where the domain that Velázquez had over classical anatomy and still lives is perceived. It even perfectly represents Vulcan's limp, in the classic way, with a wonderful contrast. Paul of Valladolid. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1635. We can think from the words of Manet, a true fan of Velázquez, that he is exaggerating a little, but the truth is that this work is simply amazing, whichever way you look at it. And as in all the production of genius, the more you look at it, the better it becomes, the more nuances come out, the more things appear. And as the colleague Manet says, the more amazed you are. This is a simple portrait of one of the palace jesters. We already know the excellent collection of buffoons with, shall we say, defects. Pablo de Valladolid, on the other hand, did not amuse the court because of his deformity, but rather because of his wit and personality. Let us remember that we are in the Golden Age, and in Spain there has never been so much ingenuity and talent again. Apparently Pablo de Valladolid was like a stand-up comedian who amused the king and others with his jokes and anecdotes. And it must have been so good that it deserved to be portrayed by Don Diego. Velázquez paints him austerely, full-length and sparse in color. Even the bottom disappears. There is not even separation between floor and wall. Pablo de Valladolid floats in space. It is a revolutionary work. And as Manet says, amazing. The Frenchman would imitate Velázquez on more than one occasion. We begin to look at the painting, and that sobriety becomes perfect for a portrait, because nothing distracts us from the representation of the sitter. And we look a little more, and that initially neutral background begins to vibrate, to generate an almost mystical space, as if this comedian from the Golden Age were like a levitating saint. Old woman frying eggs. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1618. Velázquez, at the age of 19, presents us with El Bodegón, a kitchen illuminated with a dim background and two figures from the popular class, but above all a succession of objects that amaze for their uniqueness. Each object in the painting has its different textures, nuances and essences. Each one has its own life. The genius of the painting even goes so far as to distort the perspective a bit so that we can see what is on the table. Even those frying eggs seem to be alive within the painting. He manages to show the process of change by which the transparent white of the raw egg becomes opaque as it curdles. The people in the painting almost seem like objects too. I say this because they seem to have become immobilized, and Velázquez treats them with the same detachment and objectivity as the onion or the basket hanging from the ceiling. The truth is that Velázquez was a little angry because the still life genre was disdained by theorists in those years precisely because it lacked subject, so the painter wanted to dignify it in this impressive way. And knowing Velázquez, it is more than certain that this painting has an issue, and a big one. Today the value of this work by Velázquez is incalculable. Portrait of Juan de Pareja. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1650. Velázquez had slaves. Seen through the eyes of the 17th century, this was something perfectly legal. In fact, almost all civilian Baroque painters had one to assist them in the workshop. Juan de Pareja helped the master in the tasks of grinding the colors and preparing the canvases until, during a trip to Rome on November 23, 1650, he decided to grant him freedom. That same year, he had painted the portrait you have on screen, and which is considered one of the best portraits of Velázquez. He did it as a kind of training for his best portrait, that of Pope Innocent X. There we have Juan, also a painter, who stares at us from half-profile. He seems like a competent guy. A black, yes sir. And very proud, as James Brown would say. Velázquez opts for an austere palette, and adopts a very loose brushstroke style, a trademark of the house. In this way he achieves a work almost, with which he manages to bring an intense vitality to his model. We already know that Velázquez was one of the best portraitists in the history of art, capable of transforming a few brushstrokes of pigment on a canvas into something alive. Upon obtaining his freedom, Juan de Pareja was able to open his workshop and demonstrate his skills with the brush, despite the fact that in Spain at the time the figure of a black painter was something of the most exotic. Even so, it was quite successful in that distant golden age. View of the garden of the Villa Medici in Rome with the statue of Ariadne. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1630. In this representation of one of the spaces in the garden of the Villa Medici in Rome we have, perhaps, one of the first landscapes in themselves in the history of Western painting. Velázquez, along with other artists such as Nicolas Poussin and Claudio de Lorena, developed what is known as classicist landscape. The landscape genre thus went from being a secondary pictorial theme, which framed the scenes, to being worthy of starring, by itself, in artistic works. In this case, Velázquez represents an area of the garden of the Villa Medici, where he settled during his first trip to Rome, in which we see a Surliana, an architectural structure under which the silhouette of the sleeping Ariadne can be seen. Velázquez brought back a copy of this famous classical sculpture after his second trip to the Italian capital. But perhaps the highlight of this painting is the technique used by Velázquez, loose, undone brushwork, based on paint stains, which is very reminiscent of the one used by the Impressionists several centuries later, and that will make him an example to follow for the painters of the 19th century. This, together with the importance that Velázquez gives to light in these works, and the fact that they are carried out in the open air, means that the Andalusian artist manages to capture the moment, another of the concerns that will unite him with the Impressionists. View of the garden of the Villa Medici in Rome with the statue of Ariadne represents a pictorial experiment by Velázquez in terms of technique, light and landscape, and one of the most acclaimed works by his fellow painters centuries later. Crucified Christ. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1632. Juan Galliano recounts, in his brief and subjective biography of Velázquez, that Francisco Pacheco, Diego's teacher, mentor and father-in-law, had certain hobbies in his faculty as advisor to the Holy Office in matters of religious pictorial representation. Among them there were little things, like that Saint Sebastian could not be a beardless and delicate young man, but that he must be a very hard macho battle-hardened, or that Christ must appear nailed to the cross with 4 nails, instead of the 3 regulations, according to historical practical issues. This is how Pacheco, in a representation of the crucified, dedicated to Christ a most insubstantial and orthopedic pose, in a display of 4 claveism instead of the infallible option of the 3. So much was the joke among those of the time that a rhyme was even made with the purpose of the feet, who put you like this, Lord, so bland and so dry. You will tell me that, love, but I say that, Pacheco. Years later, Velázquez, well inspired by his first trip to Italy and putting into practice the ideas of his teacher, executed his second Christ with 4 nails and the miracle was performed. Were the 4 nails a bad idea? No. Actually, Zurbarán had always been successful in crucifixions with 4 nails. The reality is that Velázquez's Christ is a miracle because it goes beyond the faculty that man has over the technique to create. In this way, Velázquez, with a conception almost close to photography, develops both here and in much of his work a way of painting that tends to the true, both in form and in substance. In an exacerbated idealism and on a large scale, Velázquez paints the most sublime crucified Christ in art. And yet there is a truth enclosed in the canvas that is closer to reason than to artifice, as if it were a secret that augurs further discoveries and was waiting to be revealed, ready to be resolved just a few moments before disappear. It's not that Unamuno was a very religious person, he really wasn't. But the man could spend hours and hours contemplating this painting. On the one hand, the idea of believing in the existence of a God-man made him cringe, and yet, he had no other alternative. This was the only way to make peace with his mortal nature and resign himself to the idea that everything passes through total disappearance. The darkness of death seemed more bearable than seeing the blackness that solemnly and protectively cradles the Christ who, if he has not yet died, is about to do so. The crucified Christ was painted between 1631 and 1632 for the convent of the Benedictines of San Placido in Madrid. The nude is the protagonist of the work, and in such a way the precision in the anatomy of the body, with special detail to the treatment of the folds in the cloth of purity. In it, the delicate posture of Christ has been resolved with a slight contrapposto, providing harmony. Despite the rawness of the scene, the amount of blood used has been meticulously chosen, although it is presumed that originally there would have been more. The contrast of light and shadow stands out, especially in the face, the result of Caravaggio's tenebrist influence. Adoration of the Kings. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1619. After seeing the Eastern Star, the Magi, who according to Christian tradition specify their number as 3, go to Bethlehem and offer their 3 gifts to the child Jesus: gold as king, frankincense as God, and myrrh as man. Velázquez adds the Virgin Mary, Saint Joseph and a page to the group, who fill almost the entire canvas with the exception of a small twilight landscape in the background. The artist was 20 years old when he painted this magnificent painting, and it can be seen that the boy was pointing out ways. We see it in the fact of putting all those people in the ornate composition to convey proximity, bathe it with that night light to give the scene intimacy, and paint like the master he would be in the future. Not even a beginner's clumsiness is seen in the work. Velázquez would become a court painter years later, and today one of the best in the world. Mercury and Argos. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1659. This is the story of a love drama narrated by the poet Ovid in his book, The Metamorphoses. The story goes that the supreme god, Jupiter, had a lover named Io, whom he loved passionately, and for this reason his wife Juno was tremendously jealous. Fearful of his wife's wrath, Jupiter decides to turn his lover into a white calf to protect her, but Juno discovers the ruse and cunningly manages to convince Jupiter to give him the calf. With the calf in her possession, the wife decides to confine the lover in the care of Argos, a 100-eyed giant who never sleeps, since one of his eyes always remains open. When Jupiter finds out, he gets angry and decides to send Mercury, the messenger of the gods, so that with the sound of his syrinx he puts the giant to sleep and kills him with the purpose of freeing the lover. When Juno decides to go see how things were going, she finds the giant Argus dead. Grief-stricken at the loss of her faithful servant, the goddess collects the 100 eyes of Argos and delicately places them, one by one, on the tail of the peacock, her favorite animal. In the work, Velázquez portrays this story, the moment in which Mercury stealthily prepares to kill a humanized giant and already lulled to sleep by the sound of his flute. Behind him we see the calf Io, in a reduced landscape, in which the characters take up most of the space. Since mythological themes had an important boom in the Baroque era, the episode of Mercury and Argos was represented by various artists such as Rubens and had various versions. The fact is that Velázquez's version differs in several aspects from the other artists, conferring his naturalistic vision both on the chosen moment and on the less heroic treatment of the subject, although it maintains the classic attributes of the myth, such as the winged helmet of Mercury or Io herself in the form of a calf. Velázquez was always interested in representing the mythological gods as people with common features. He humanized his representations and tried to stage the themes in natural spaces without idealizations or heroic apologies. This way of representing the themes of mythology reached with Velázquez an expressiveness and emotion without comparison, granting a close, understandable and everyday point of view to the mythological theme. This canvas was part of a series of 4 works, all related to mythological subjects and made by Velázquez, painter-decorator of the Spanish court. They were made for the Hall of Mirrors of the Alcazar of Madrid. In 1734 fire devastated the palace, and of the 4 canvases only this one was saved. In the context of the court, the theme was an allegory of the weakness of reason represented by Argos, compared to carnal delight personified in Mercury. The virtue of the reason of the state was praised as an argument of the political propaganda program in the court of Felipe IV. Deer Head. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1630. When choosing paintings that cause an impact on the viewer, a frequent tendency is to go for dramatic, violent, morbid, erratic themes, with bizarre characters, etc. The Baroque of the 17th century makes this task much easier since we can find everything in that century of excess. But we can also look at the affable, serene painters who fled from artifice, such as Vermeer or de la Tour, who managed to capture the small and inconsequential. Another that stands out for its simplification, both in compositions and concepts, is Velázquez. The maximum austerity was achieved in a small painting, which reflects his ability to go against the current in full Baroque, the deer's head, of absolute genius that, however, goes quite unnoticed. Many critics associate it with the hunting paintings, commissioned by King Philip IV. There is no precedent for a portrait of an animal that, without being domestic, looks at the viewer without any hint of humanization. It is, therefore, a snapshot taken of a wild animal, which greatly complicates its pictorial expression. The images of deer at the time used to be associated with hunting scenes. But until that moment, no painter had made a portrait of a non-domestic animal, for the sheer pleasure of doing it. It is the species Cervus elephas, one of the three species of the genus Cervus, also called red or European deer, which although its distribution has been reduced in Europe, North Africa and Western Asia in recent centuries, in other regions of the world such as South America, is a pest that displaces other local species. The one reflected by Velázquez belongs to the subspecies Cervus elephas hispanicus, exclusive to the peninsula and smaller than the one found north of the Pyrenees. The population in Spain is around 300,000 and is increasing. Its greatest threat is genetic mixing with specimens of other subspecies so that the antlers of the hunted males are larger. I do not know why there are people who love to have the antlers of a deer hanging on the wall. It is possible that Velázquez did not like it either and he painted this one anyway, so natural and extraordinarily alive, like his small and anonymous rejection of the hunting tastes of his boss, Felipe IV. Moreover, it is not ruled out that Velázquez, just as the great Rosa Bonheur did 2.5 centuries later, reflected her admiration for the beautiful deer. The Spinners. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1657. Pure Baroque theatre on a stage meticulously composed by an extraterrestrial Velázquez who wants to tell us the fable of Arachne from a more intellectual and ingenious perspective, in the manner of the great brains of the Spanish Golden Age. Arachne, according to Ovid, was a young woman who knitted so well that she constantly bragged about it and even went around saying that she did it better than the goddess Athena. Tired of so much bravado, Athena dressed up as an old woman and challenged her to a contest to make the best tapestry, and the smug Arachne could not think of a better theme than to represent the infidelities of the gods. Athena, offended, took off her costume and decided to settle the matter by turning her into a spider. That is why spiders weave so well. Velázquez takes advantage of this story to reflect on creation and represents Arachne's workshop with the young artist masterfully weaving and the goddess disguised as an old woman on the left. We know it's her because of the teenage legs she shows us. We can only be amazed at this wonder painted with the famous aerial perspective of genius. Even the movement of the cat is spectacular. The whole painting seems to move. In the background, in this second stage, Velázquez once again paints the characters in front of a tapestry. In it, we see represented the libidinous loves of Zeus, the father of Athene. It is the outcome of the fable, and the goddess already has her attributes, armor, and a very bad host. She is going to transform the young Arachne into a spider, condemned to weave eternally. Thus, we have several scenes in one, several theatrical games, several performances, several concepts in one. It is a typical Baroque game. Velázquez leaves the scene in front dimly lit and gives more light to the scene in the background, to create a game of glances in the spectator and make sure that we understand what he wants to say. The Three Musicians. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1616. His name was Diego Velázquez, a 17-year-old boy. The court of Madrid was still far away. He was in Seville, which was then the richest, most cosmopolitan and most populous city in Spain, and he was learning painting in Francisco Pacheco's workshop. Of humble origins, he sometimes took them for a hidalgo. Perhaps he was haunted by his noble past. In addition to grinding pigments and stretching canvases for his teacher, he would keep an eye on his daughter Juana, whom he would marry shortly after and with whom he would remain for 40 years. At that time he must have absorbed the art that was made in Italy, since Seville was full of Italians and Flemish, and with this new way of painting he made quite a few genre paintings with still lifes, like this one of the first preserved works by Velázquez. In a dark room, 3 musicians and a monkey are arranged around a table. One of them, the youngest, smiles and looks at us. So does the ape. It is a Baroque resource to get us into the picture. Baroque is also the stimulation of the senses on the canvas, hearing, touch, taste and smell join sight to make a kind of allegorical representation of the senses. Velázquez was still learning. The light is strange, the composition wavering. But we can already get an idea that this 17-year-old would give a lot to talk about in the future. Mars Resting. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1638. Diego Velázquez shows Mars, god of war on a human scale. The Sevillian genius represents him a little decrepit, melancholic and pensive. He is naked, except for that blue cloth that covers his parts. Velázquez paints a man of flesh and blood rather than a god. At his feet there are some contemporary weapons lying around when the painting was painted. Many wanted to see in the mustache of Mars a reference to the tercios of Flanders, since these soldiers wore that characteristic mustache. Perhaps the painter wanted to allude to the 80 Years' War that was coming to an end in those days, and above all the military decline of Spain, since for the Spanish crown, the independence of the United Provinces in the Netherlands represented an enormous loss of its prestige and international hegemony. That is why the god of war is thoughtful, perhaps reflecting on what Spain was painting in that contest. Although knowing Velázquez's ball, and the respect he felt for the king, this theory loses some weight. In pictorial terms, Velázquez portrayed the god in a very pasty way, with almost impressionistic color spots, and this results in a very effective modeling of the flesh, almost alive and vibrant. Thus, there are parts of the painting that seem unfinished, the hand, for example, almost like sketches. Portrait of Gongora. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1622. I present to you Luis de Gongora y Argot, one of the main exponents of the Spanish Golden Age. The Cordovan writer was a most brilliant and influential type, who was admired by such brilliant and influential types as Miguel de Cervantes or Diego Rodríguez de Silva y Velázquez. There is nothing. However, we all know that Gongora also had illustrious enemies, such as Lope de Vega or Francisco de Quevedo, who took the rivalry to heights never seen before. Both hurled witty taunts at each other, leveling the insult at one of the fine arts. Gongora laughed at Quevedo's myopia and limp, and accused him of being a bad Hellenist and drunk. Quevedo counterattacked, calling him a bugerin and mocking, among other things, Gongora's gambling addiction and big nose, which he attributed to his supposed Hebrew origins. We already know his famous verses. Once upon a man stuck a nose. Once upon a superlative nose. Once upon a saying nose and right. Once upon a time there was a very bearded swordfish. It was a badly faced sundial. Once upon a thoughtful alqueter. There was an elephant upside down. Ovidio Nason was more nosy. Once upon a spur of a galley. Once upon a pyramid in Egypt. The 12 tribes of noses was. Once upon a very nosy infinity. A lot of nose so fierce that in the face of honest it was a crime. Quevedo goes a bit too far with hyperbole and anti-Semitism, but as we see in Velázquez's portrait of him, the truth is that Mr. Gongora was not in the wrong. Velázquez was, if not the best, one of the best portrait painters in Western painting, and perhaps this portrait of the poet is perfect proof of that talent. An excellent physical, but also psychological study of Gongora, carried out by an ambitious artist who was 23 years old at the time. In this picture, we can almost intuit a bitter and taciturn personality, perhaps due to the virulent attacks of his ingenious rival. The Drunks. Artwork by Diego Velázquez, from the year 1629. Velázquez, who titled this painting The Triumph of Bacchus, although it is popularly known as The Drunks. The artist tells how the god of wine comes down to earth and has a few drinks with ordinary people that we can find in any tavern. Because that's what the painting is about, a frieze of naturalistic figures. Bacchus is a little pale and has a little paunch. He is sitting on top of a barrel of wine and his head is crowned by the leaf of the vine. We don't know why, but he's putting another ivy crown on one of the characters. Many historians believe that the crowned one is a poet inspired by Bacchus. Behind Bacchus is a satyr raising a crystal goblet in toast. Surrounding the god, we have a group of drunks with red mugs, smiling at us, almost inviting us to get drunk with them. That was all for today's video. Tell us what you thought, and if you liked it, please give us your subscription and your like. This way you support the art community on YouTube. Until the next video, have a nice day.